Ever stared at Swagger doc wondering how to turn all those endpoints into actual tests? Today, we'll transform this API documentation into a bulletproof suite using Playwright and TypeScript. In 15 minutes, you learn to read Swagger docs like a pro, generate TypeScript types from schemas, and write tests that catch bugs before your user do. Let's dive in. Think of Swagger as a blueprint of an API, like architectural drawings for a building. It tells you every endpoint what data to send and what you get back. We'll use the famous pet store API. It's the hello world of API example, let's say, and is available online. Just digit pet store Swagger API. Here is what we can do. Every API has a data model. In Swagger, these are called schema. Let's look at the pet schema. As you can see here, we have our Swagger pet store example. Swagger looks exactly like this. You have the base URL of your API instance that can be different based on what I've been working on. And generally, you have different calls documented in your company documentation. So you should have access to Swagger and see all the calls, which if you open them up for the post call, you can get information related to the parameters that are needed that can be used in your API. And so you can use simply Playwright. The response also, we know how what a successful response can be, which is, for example, this schema. You can open and close all different calls. For example, this is a call to pet to slash pet. This is to slash pet ID. You can have put call to pet, get call to find by status, where we have the status that can be all these different statuses. And the code response here is this, etc., etc., etc. So why I shown you Swagger? Because thanks to understanding which parameters we might want to use for our testing, for example, we can get this schema. We can transform this schema, especially if schema are quite complex, like this with more nested code. You can create types. It is advised to create types so interfaces which contain the characteristic of the call. Um, you can see here, for example, this is what type that define what is mandatory and what is not, and so basically the data that it can be mandatory or not. And this helps to enforce code quality in your test and to ensure that the test and the parameters stored somewhere correctly so that if we need to create our body and fill it in, we know exactly where to look at. By the way, in Swagger, there is a way, pro tip, to basically create the types generated automatically based on your Swagger. So to do that, you can simply run a script like this, npx OpenAI TypeScript, with the link to the Swagger JSON file and the partial path to where you want to create um, the types. And remember to include -o, as it is written here. This will allow you to generate the types without having to do them manually. Otherwise, that will take a bit longer. So this is a small hack that will simplify this step. Let's take this example. This is a post call to slash pet. Here we have the body and a body example. You might wonder, how do I know when I create a type if category is mandatory or not? The body is mandatory as is written here. So you can click to this to model section. Here you can see that what is mandatory is the name and the photo URL, while the category, the tags, the status, and the ID are not mandatory. So you can even not put them. It will still create and post, probably create a runtime DD, but in general will be successful the call. Another thing you might want to notice in Swagger is that you could actually test this API right away there. For example, let's say that you're using this example and you want to execute the call, then you can get the result exactly how it would come. You can even change, for example, let's now remove the category and let's execute like this. You can see that the response was successful, but we don't have the category in the response. And you can see that the response was successful anyway. Another thing to highlight here is that you see that is 200 undocumented, but also that is a 405 response, which it means invalid input. Why that? Because when we sent the call, we didn't actually insert the name, like name, like Paul, another name. But we insert a string and we didn't put valid data. Um, but if we insert the right data, the response will be correct with the 200 also there. I want just to clarify that the 405 message you see here as invalid input is shown because obviously pet store, this call, is an API call that doesn't accept post considering that it's a public API. So obviously, if you send this call, it's not gonna exactly send it correctly. So, but the response of the bot is 200, which if we want to know at the moment. So how this is transferred to the code aspect of Playwright? So what we need to do is to get the schema bit and create the types. So what I did is to create under common the folder types and within it our pet store API types, which comprehend exactly the schema that were inside the Swagger. So if we go, for example, to our Swagger, we can see this schema gives us a hint of how to implement that to our code. That exactly what it is has been done here. Um, as you can see, we created the category schema, the tag schema, the pet schema, which contain the category, which is a category interface which has these two data values, etc., etc., etc. This will allow us to make sure we're making the correct call and you have the correct type when we want to implement it. Second thing, having the types, we can then create in a page object model of our API calls for our pet store API. And what we did here, remember that the API request context is to be imported from Playwright test to make the request call. In the constructor, in fact, we have insert request, which is equal to API request context. This will allow us to use the request we also instantiated initially in the class. We have a base URL. If you want to state it, you state it. Otherwise, you can call URL in full. If there is an API key, you state it not here, but in a .env file. But here, this is only an example. And here we have our create pet. So this is a post call that we do to get a response as a pet object, which was the type page which we created here. The pet the response is exactly this. So the response will be with this schema, and the way you get the response is this dot request dot post. What you post, the URL of the API call that you want to perform, and the data. Here you insert the data, which can contain the body and the headers. The body, in this case, we call it data. The data is equal to pet. Pet is an instance of the pet object, which we created in the types. Otherwise, you can simply open an object and insert manually the value. If you don't want to, it's not mandatory to put the types, but it's recommendable, especially if you have big objects. And also, it's important to review it if the API changes over time. By the way, we insert here pet. This will make our life easier now to just insert the schema which we want to insert, which is pet, and head and the headers, and the API key if we have. And then we can check if the response is the one we want. So obviously the data we can, now we have only the schema of the data that we are sending, but then we can insert because we have as a parameter, we can insert the data later in the test. So we get save if the response is 200, then we get the JSON. The response.json will give us the data, the response that we are looking for. We have also the get, when we do the get request, instead of this that request that post, obviously you put get with the correct URL and the parameters, the correct parameters, with the same logic as we explained above. And if we need headers, we add headers. All this is driven by the Swagger documentation, etc., etc. In the end, one thing you could do is either you could store the data in a data file as it is written here, if you want to simply fill data with the predefined values, then you can predefine and document them in the test, or you can do it manually, simply call them within the test. But if you have to, generally, if you can, it's a good idea to add uh, the data file here if you need to do test driven on specific data. In the end, we can finally perform the test. So the test will import the data file, the API page object model file, and the types. So everything we just discussed. So at this point, we can instantiate the objects so that we can action on them. We can instantiate before each test the pet store API, so that we can use the pet store API to perform the calls. So here, as you can see, the pet store API is instantiated inside the test. here we have our fixture request that we can use to perform the request. It's important to implement it to make it this work. And as you can see also here, pets to API has between parentheses the request fixture called. What the new pet is equal to test data, which is the name of the file. We call this when we created the data file. We called when we imported this object as test data. That's why we're getting test data dot valid pets here and dot whatever we want to select. So that's selecting the first valid pet, and is what is doing here is simply to create a new pet is calling await pet store API dot create pet new pet. This simplify a lot the logic. Otherwise, here you would do the same logic which we did the page object model, which was this one where we call the this that request that post is much cleaner to do all the operational part in the page object model rather than the test right away. It is cleaner and is the best practice. So that's it. Once we sent here a post request, and we can now check that the data, the result of the post request contains the property ID, that name is equal to the data we stored in the JSON file, new pet. Yeah, as we can see, is equivalent to the first pet in that data file. So that the name of that pet is taken from there. The photo URLs should be correspondent to the photo URLs, and so on. Here instead we do the get request. So where is the get request? Here, the get request, where we perform pet store API dot find pets by status available. Now we can check once we perform the get request, which was performed inside this method, that the array should be true. So this element should be an array. For each element, every element should be correspondent to the corresponding data that we want to prove. Basically, it's much cleaner. That's it. This was the panoramic on API testing. There is much more we could be said in API testing, but this was a bit an introduction. I wanted to share with you. Let me know if this video was useful. Let me know. Consider to like, comment, subscribe the channel, and see you in the next video.